Welcome to the discussion on Russia under Putin, expansion or consolidation. We are privileged to have two expert speakers on this subject. Professor Graeme Gill from the Department of Government at Sydney University and Professor Goldsmith, also from the Department of Government at Sydney University.
So I'm what is often described as a de-skilled Sovietologist. In other words, I actually went through and finished the PhD on Soviet politics and spent some years teaching Soviet politics when the subject then, as Ben says, disappeared. And one of the lasting memories that I have is going to the American Association's, what was it called? Slavic and East European Studies Association, to their conference in 1991, which is of course the year that the Soviet Union fell. And there were about 3 panels that were there with people, big names in the field, sitting at tables like this, basically saying, well, what are we going to do now? And this was a real problem for everyone. It wasn't as much of a problem for those of us like me as it was for many of the people who are living in the former Soviet Union, but it was nevertheless a problem. What I'm going to do tonight is to try to talk a little bit about the internal situation in Russia, and I'm then going to finish by covering some of the ground that Ben has covered, but in a slightly different way, because I want to put a different sort of spin on it, if only for discussion. One of the prevailing myths of Russia, or about Russia, is that during the 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, Russia was a thriving democracy, or if not a thriving democracy, a political system which was clearly on its way to being democratic. And then, at the end of the 1990s, Yeltsin was replaced by Vladimir Putin, and what Putin did was to grab hold of the political system and completely change it so that it went into a much more authoritarian direction. Now that is clearly a myth. It's not a myth because Putin's a Democrat, because he clearly isn't. It's a myth because Russia was never a democracy, even under Yeltsin. Certainly, Yeltsin introduced a wide range of measures which were consistent with the establishment of a democratic system, but with one exception. And that exception was that in 1996, people were pressing him to postpone the election because he was going to lose. He didn't do it, he went through and he held the election. But with that one exception, most of the moves that Yeltsin made in the political sphere actually closed down democratic space, closed down the room for independent political activity, and created the basis for a system which was going to be authoritarian and upon which Putin built. The difference between Putin and Yeltsin is not that Yeltsin's a Democrat and Putin is an authoritarian. The difference is that Putin has been reasonably efficient and Yeltsin was very inefficient. If we look at what's happened since Putin came to power, this is the period which I want to concentrate on. If we look at that, what we've seen has been the continuation of the trends developed, many of the trends developed under Yeltsin. In the political sphere, we've seen the continued manipulation of the electoral process. Began under Yeltsin. I mean, in the first election in 1993, Yeltsin banned a number of parties, and he banned a number of newspapers. Hardly the actions of a Democrat. Putin hasn't banned any party. He hasn't had to, because he's been able to manipulate the system in such a way that the parties who oppose him, and there are a few of them, the parties that oppose him are incredibly weak. Those groups that opposed Yeltsin, in particular the communists and also the nationalists of various stripes, because when you talk about nationalists in in Russia, you're talking about a very wide spectrum, but those groups who opposed Yeltsin, Putin has co-opted. The communists are still presented, particularly in the Western press, as the main opposition party. And during the election, they criticised the president, and they criticised the president's party. But in the Duma, the parliament, by and large, they vote with the ruling party, they vote with Yeltsin, with Putin. And similarly with most of the nationalist groups. So that what Putin has been able to do has been to sort of cauterise the opposition to Yeltsin by co-opting it into the system. And what that has done has enabled him to manipulate the electoral process in such a way that I'm getting confused here, that Putin's party wins the election easily, including the 2011 election after which there were protests, and the president wins the election easily once again. We can talk later, if you like, about the methods of manipulating the election, but what's happened has been that he has been able to routinise that manipulation in a way that Yeltsin wasn't. So we've seen basically a closing down of the capacity for independent political organisation against Putin, against the Russian leadership. We've also seen a closing down of public space, in the sense that the room for popular dissent has significantly reduced. This was happening all through the 2000s, but it seems to have increased over the last 12 or 18 months since Putin was re-elected as president. I was in Russia, I don't know, 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago, and I was there in the November of last year. And the November of last year was the first time that I've been in that country since the Soviet period, where members of what we can loosely call the liberal intelligentsia, so they're not typical of the population, clearly they're not typical of the population, but where members of the liberal intelligentsia talked about the desirability of immigrating. And it was immigration because they felt that they could not any longer speak up in safety. So what we've seen, that reflects this closing down of the room for public debate. It may sound strange to say that in the light of the fact that in 2011, in December 2011, the elections to the Duma were held, and that was followed by a series of popular demonstrations that lasted into about September of the next year. Largest demonstrations that have been seen in Russia since the late 1980s, since the perestroika period under Gorbachev. But the interesting thing about those demonstrations is what little effect they had. There has really been no major change as a result of the demonstrations. Putin and the authorities gave pseudo concessions, if you like, things which at the time looked like concessions, but which the way that they've played out have actually not been concessions at all. And what this reflects is the way in which the whole system, if you like, has tightened up. There's increasing talk of self-censorship on the part of journalists and of newspaper editors. There is formally no censorship system as such, but clearly if certain major publications step out of line, they'll get a telephone call. And then they may get audited, their tax books may get audited. The editor may find that someone roughs him up on the way home from work. At worst, journalists have clearly been killed. Yeah. So the whole room, if you like, for public debate has been shrunk. That doesn't mean there is no public debate. It doesn't mean that there is no room for people to dissent, because there is. But the point is that the regime controls all of the major media outlets that have national coverage. The very small radio stations that only broadcast to Moscow, some Moscow suburbs, or the small local newspaper, they don't care about. You know, people can almost say what they like there, but that doesn't matter because it's not getting public exposure nationally, and that's what's really important. But the other thing that's important to realise is that this closing of democratic space, if you like, is something which seems to have widespread popular support. If we look at the public opinion polls, and in Russia there is an independent public opinion polling organisation which is still able to function. There's also one that's closely related to the state. But but both of them give broadly similar sorts of reports by and large, so you've got to assume that they're accurate. If we look at the effect of opinion polling and what that tells us about popular views, what it tells us is that people like the idea of democracy. Democracy's fine, but not Western-style democracy. Because what did Western-style democracy do? Western-style democracy was introduced, rhetorically at least, at the same time as economic reform in the early 1990s. And the effect of economic reform in the early 1990s was to send something like 60% of the population below the poverty line. So they see Western democracy as being something that, surprise, surprise, was a bit like what Soviet propaganda said it used to be like. So there's this really sort of interesting situation where what you've got is that people didn't believe Soviet propaganda about the West, particularly towards the end of the Soviet Union, but now their view of democracy, market economy and this sort of thing is very similar to the view that was being proposed at that time. So they like democracy but not like in the West. What they want, they say, is democracy that's consistent with our traditions. Now, the problem of course is, what do we mean by our traditions? You know, at one level our traditions mean the extreme conservatism of the Slavophiles and the people who conducted the pogroms against the Jews towards the end of the imperial period, people who are extremely right-wing. At the other level, at the other end, it means the Bolsheviks and extreme leftism. So what's meant by tradition? Now, of course, Putin doesn't try to enunciate very much what the tradition is. Because you know, you're rather hiding to nothing if you do that. But what he does do is that he tries to frame the discussion of tradition in terms that suit his particular political perspective. And what he's done over the last 12, 14 years is to project an image that has a couple of components. One, Russia needs a strong leader. Russia has only prospered when it's had a strong leader. Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, Stalin, and of course, Putin. But there is this strong sense that comes across. Russia needs a strong leader. Secondly, democracy. We need democracy. How do we define democracy? Democracy is defined as agreement, consensus between the people and the government. But if we have a strong notion of a strong leader, and democracy as agreement between the government and the people, it's presumably not the people who are going to be saying what should be done. It's going to be the government and the strong leader. So that democracy immediately becomes, if you like, a concept that involves not accountability to the mass of the populace, but rather the mass of the populace falling in behind the decisions and the views of the government. If we look again at the public opinion polls, there's an overwhelming support for the argument about the strong leader. And they're specifically asked, if it's a choice between democracy and a strong leader, what do you want? They say, the strong leader. The other part of the image that Putin projects is that Russia has been and is continually under attack. It hasn't gone quite as far as Stalin in a 1930s speech where he said, you know, we were beaten by the Turks, we were beaten by the Swedes, we were beaten by the Poles, we were beaten by the Lithuanians. It's only by being a strong state can we stand up and defend ourselves. But that's what he's getting at. His argument is that the West is not an alien culture, because clearly there are so many interconnections. But Russia is not intrinsically part of the West. Russia also has other sources of cultural development upon which it draws. And therefore, we, that is Russia, cannot simply accept integration into the West. And what this means is that he is sensitive, and I think the people have become somewhat sensitive to slights by the West, to what they perceive as attacks by the West. Ben's quite right. The expansion of NATO was almost the worst possible thing that the West could have done if what they wanted to do was to establish a cooperative relationship with Russia. After all, from Moscow's perspective, what is NATO for if it's not anti-Russia? If it includes virtually everybody on the European continent except Russia, which could be the case, what the hell is it there for? And the problem, of course, is that the NATO people cannot answer that. They have not been able to give a coherent rationale for the continued existence of NATO. Furthermore, the Russians firmly believe that in 1989 they were given the guarantee by the Americans that if they, the Soviets at that stage, went along with the unification of Germany, the borders of NATO would not extend past the borders of Germany. So Gorbachev gave the green light for the unification of Germany. Within 6 years, the borders of NATO were within 150 kilometres of St. Petersburg, second biggest city in the country. It's clearly seen as a breach of faith. They argue the Americans have abandoned the ABM Treaty, which was the basis of military balance during the Cold War. Why would they do that if they didn't want to change that balance? From Moscow, they believe that the establishment of an American early warning missile detection system in Poland is directed against them, as opposed to being directed against Iran, which is what the Americans say it is. Now, I don't know which way missiles from Iran are going to go, but from Moscow, it looks as though it's directed at them. The wacky level or wing of Russian opinion also blames the West for the economic crisis of the early 1990s. After all, Why did Yeltsin introduce the economic reforms that he did introduce? The argument that they put forward is he introduced them because the Western advisors told him to, so that the West gets blamed for the economic crisis as well. See, the image I'm trying to suggest is that there is a sense in which the Russian claim to being under pressure from the West is valid, certainly seen from Moscow. And that's the way that the Ukrainian issue needs, I think, to be seen. The danger let me go back again. Putin's image, the image that he's been putting forward, is clearly a nationalist image. It's a strong Russia. We need a strong Russian image. Up until 2012, 2011 perhaps, that image was non-racial. In other words, when he talked about Russians, he meant everyone who lived in Russia. Sometimes he didn't, sometimes he meant ethnic Russians, but by and large it was an inclusive notion. Since he's been re-elected in 2012, his language has changed. It's not an exclusivist view that he now puts forward, but he can be interpreted as saying, when he talks about Russians, he means ethnic Russians. And this has been taken up by people at the next level down. So that what you're getting is an increasingly sort of racialised view, if you like, of what Russia means. But within that racialised view, Ukrainians are included, because Ukrainians are Slavs, as are Belarusians. Chechens aren't. And Chechens are the main whipping boy in Russia. But Chechens aren't, Turks aren't, Finns aren't, Moldavians, they aren't, but Ukrainians are. So that I think the attitude to Ukraine and the takeover of Crimea is, as Ben said, takeover of Crimea is clearly illegal. I think in some ways it's understandable, if not forgivable. I don't think it's anything like Sudan, for a whole sort of variety of reasons. I would also be surprised if Putin sent troops into eastern Ukraine, unless it was on a limited sort of attempt to stop the fighting. But I think in saying that, I should also acknowledge that in 1968, when I was an undergraduate, in about June or July, I wrote an essay which, with great erudition and verve, explained why the Soviets would not send troops into Czechoslovakia. And I got the essay back, and the person who marked it had simply put on it, "History has run over the top of you." But still, I don't think they will go into Ukraine, because I don't think that they've really got anything to gain by doing so. So I don't quite know where I was going to go with that. But to finish off, what I'll say is that the situation domestically in Russia has clearly deteriorated over the last 6 or so years. I think that is principally due to internal factors, but I think that the West does have a part to play in explaining it, because what it has done is that it has enabled this sort of fortress mentality, if you like, to develop, and in doing so, that has enabled the already weak real opposition in Russia to become even weaker.